Hello, welcome everyone. Hi. Welcome everybody to this webinar. I see that many people are entering, so welcome. Hi everyone. So let's start. Today's webinar is centered on the topic of energy transition and its link with independence. We are basing our analysis and study on our annual publication, EnerFuture, and we are going to talk about fossil fuels, electricity, and energy transition, what it means for states, for people, in terms of sovereignty. So indeed, we are seeing a new paradigm of the energy world where energy security is ranking very high in the agenda of all policymakers and policy analysts, energy leaders. We've seen that in the World Issues Monitor of the World Energy Council, and it shows that the energy security, sovereignty, and geopolitical tensions are at the top of concerns. This links very strongly with military efforts, fossil fuel subsidies, clean energy subsidies, and the spending priorities of states and companies. Of course, there is at the center the energy transition, which is our core topic here at Enerdata, but indeed we see some strong modifications in some geographies, like the USA, also a bit in Europe. Some environmental backlash has been observed. The electricity demand is a key topic in terms of electric vehicles, heat pumps, industry trends, and artificial intelligence being one of them. So we'll discuss about those topics, and I hope you will have plenty of food for thought. First, a word about Enerdata. So it's been more than 34 years of energy climate research. We are a spin-off of the University of Grenoble in France, and we are still based here in Grenoble, but also in Paris and a subsidiary in Singapore. And we provide to global clients, I mean, all over the globe, all continents except Antarctica, I must say, are concerned with energy, and we are working with lots of policymakers, governmental institutions, financial world, corporate actors, and also cooperating a lot with academia and non-governmental organizations, etc. Our core expertise is global energy and climate issues, and we work with database, with models. We provide analysis questions of our clients are very strong motivators for us. We are about 65, 70 people working together. And here is a bit of a description of our expertise. So it's all a bit interlinked. We are quite a few teams working together on modeling. We have a strong expertise. We can, for example, develop an alignment between a portfolio and an objective to analyze a sector or a country. We are expert in energy climate issues with market analysis, energy transition with all its components, and a global coverage. We are not focused on one given country. We can go for the whole world in sectoral detail, in country detail, or even at the province level. We have a strong team in market intelligence also, looking at the trends of the markets and the policies that are implemented. And as you can guess from our name, we also have a strong data expertise. The topic of today is going to be the energy sovereignty and links between transition and independence. And the speakers of today's are going to be myself, Jacques Després. I've been working at Enerdata for 3 years. I'm a senior energy analyst now and project manager. Before that, I got a PhD in energy system modeling and then worked for 6 years at the European Commission in the Joint Research Center. Today with me, I have Esteban Drouet. Hello. Hello. So he's the lead modeler for EnerFuture, our publication that we'll present at the end. So I'm very happy to be here today together and talk with you on these very relevant topics of today. The first part will be introducing the scenarios and methodology, and then we'll deep dive into drillings for fuels, plugging, and the role of electricity. And the third part will be the link between the energy transition and sovereignty. And then we'll have a broader picture, a broader look on the scenarios that we worked on. And finally, some takeaways and Q&A. So don't hesitate to write your questions on the chat. We'll answer them at the end of the 45-minute presentation, and we'll be happy to discuss with you. So first, let's have a short introduction on what we are doing here, what our analysis is based on. We are using scenarios, so we are building different pathways that do not represent the most probable pathway. There is no such thing as a crystal ball. We just provide differentiated assumptions on climate and energy policies and on technologies that are made available, cheaper, more expensive. We make assumptions and we draw differentiated scenarios. Here we start from one point which is very well described thanks to our database expertise on energy aspects, demand, supply, prices, markets, emissions. And then we work through the future with those assumptions that I mentioned to provide pictures for 2050 on the same aspects, and we derive analysis based on them. So the scenarios that we are using here are called Ener-base in gray, usually here, Ener-blue, and Ener-green. So Ener-base is a continuation of existing trends. This leads to a temperature increase of about 3 degrees at the end of the century. Ener-blue is implementing the nationally determined contributions, NDCs, and this leads to about 2.5 degrees. And Ener-green is defined as reaching a well below 2 degree temperature increase. So this is defined based on the carbon budget. To build those scenarios, we are using the poles in the data model. It's a global model. It has a very high description at the geographical level. We have 66 countries and regions. So I think this is one of the best models in this aspect. It also has annual time step from today or even from the past until 2050, and a dedicated modeling of energy demand and uses, supply transformation. I'll get into that right now. It stands for Prospective Outlook on Long-Term Energy Systems. It's a model that was developed at the University of Grenoble initially, and then co-developed with the Joint Research Center of the European Commission and Enerdata. So here, our own model looks like that. We have lots of inputs and assumptions on resources, technologies, and also on GDP and population. Based on that, we run the model, looking at the whole aspect of the energy system and also international markets. So in the red rectangles, you can see the new features of this year highlighted here, like hydrogen trade and markets, and direct air capture and sequestration of CO2. And the outputs are classically energy balances with prices as well, consumption by sector and fuel, production, very detailed, and emissions as well are very detailed. Also, this gives investment numbers, so very interesting for many actors. For this edition, we have up-to-date data sets, of course, up to 2023, and policies up to 2024. We are trying to improve the modeling each year, so we have some novelties this year, and we are trying to provide more detail also, as you were working on it recently, on the electrification and very detailed indicators per sector and end uses. The question that brings us together here is based on these scenarios, based on these modeling capabilities that we have at Enerdata. What can we say, what can we interpret that links the energy transition and independence, sovereignty? The first topic I would like to raise is this dichotomy, this distinction between the perspectives of the US presidency that repeats and repeats over and over again that the government and the corporate actors should go for more fossil fuel extraction, with his famously drill baby drill. And in other regions, we see other perspectives. For example, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, liked to to mention the opposite sentence of plug baby plug at the French summit of artificial intelligence earlier this year. So those two perspectives are very different in terms of energy transitions. So let's look at what we have as results of our scenarios first in terms of fossil fuel markets, right? So oil supply. In all our scenarios, we expect a peak production. For Enerdata, it's going to be a plateau around 2032, slowly decreasing afterwards. For Enerblue, we see a reduction by almost half from the peak to 2050. And for Energreen, a reduction by 2/3 of the supply of oil. So this is represented here in terms of picture. Out of 10 barrels extracted today, there will be only 3.5 in 2050, according to Energreen. In the USA specifically, this means that the production would go down from 18 million barrels per day today to around 3.8 in Energreen or 5.6 in Enerdata. So the conclusion is that the oil supply is decreasing in all scenarios, but in various proportions. And respecting the climate commitments, or even just the engagement in blue, does not leave space for increasing supply. Now, for gas, it's a bit more contrasted. There is a strong increase in Enerdata with a 50% increase of production by 2050, whereas in Energreen, it's a reduction by 2/3, a bit like oil just before. In the US in particular, the gas production could increase by 20% or reduce to almost zero in Energreen. I mean, it becomes insignificant. In the European economic area, it could reduce in all scenarios, but depending on the ambition, it could reduce by 30% or up to three quarters. The role of the Gulf region in the gas supply is going to increase from the 21% of the gas supply today to about 26% in Enerdata and Energreen, and much higher in Enerblue actually. So in Enerdata, more specifically, we see Russia and the USA with a very strong role as today, roughly 15% of global production. So this keeps the concentration of the market close to current levels. We just see one additional actor in this scenario, which is China, which could become one of the leading gas producers as well. So we would have the Gulf region, Russia, USA, China. But this is very different in Energreen, for example. We have a strong decrease overall of production. And this ends up being about a quarter for the Gulf region, a bit like in Enerdata. But the role of Russia and the US would go down significantly to about 5 to 9% only of the global market shares. So this is very significant because it shows that the market would be much more distributed. There would be resources exploited a bit everywhere, but no single actor except the Gulf region, which still reinforces its hegemony. In terms of fossil fuels emissions, just to get a view here, you can see how the Enerdata emissions are going to decrease slowly, mainly driven by the coal role in dark gray. For Enerblue, we have a drop of coal and a slight decrease of oil. And this gets to a reduction of more than half of emissions. And for Energreen, a drop of emissions across all fossil fuels. Of course, if there is less fossil fuels, it means that we have more energy from somewhere else, right? So we're going to jump now to the electricity section. We are going to see an increase of electricity across all scenarios. The annual growth rates are a bit different. For Enerdata, it's 2.3%, and for Energreen, 2.8%. So it's not a huge gap. You can see on the right side graphic as well. Overall, we're going to double the production of electricity between now and 2050. But there are small variations across scenarios. The variations are quite small, I would say. I think it's one of the surprising facts that we end up finding. And this is also explained by an increase of efficiency. So efficiency is also key. Reducing the overall energy demand allows to reduce this electricity gap between base and green, between a business as usual scenario and a Paris compatible scenario. The efficiency is increasing a lot. You can see in a bit transparent behind the electricity curves, the oil and gas are dramatically changing between scenarios, but this is not the case for electricity, which in all cases increases at 2.5% per year at a global average. If we compare that to the population, it's the same as increasing from 3.5 megawatt hour per person to 5.2 in Enerbase and up to 6 megawatt hour per person in 2050 for Energreen. Now let's have a look into the sectoral detail to understand a bit more what is hidden behind those numbers, right? So for the residential sector, we look at heat pumps mainly because it's the core of the electrification of this sector. We also have higher appliances, but the difference between the scenarios is mostly due to heat pumps and renovation. So the heat pump curve here shows a double a role of heat pumps in Enerbase of about 20% and double that in Energreen for 2050. So the uptake of the heat pump market is going to be dramatically different. This ends up in a stock of heat pumps of about 1 billion in 2050. So I'm talking here about residential sector only and for heating purposes. The renovation market is also very different, as I hinted earlier. So in 2050, we expect a multiplication by 2 in Enerbase of the current renovation market, but a factor of almost 6 in Energreen. So there is a strong difference here, and I guess the renovation actors should be very worried if we get away from the Paris compatible scenario. In most developing countries, and specifically in Africa, the main topic is clean cooking. This is the point that needs more attention. It's the majority of energy demand in those regions. So getting access to clean cooking is the first action. And also air conditioning is going to develop very strongly and will drive the electrification trend in all scenarios. For the road transport sector now, we have, of course, an increase of electric vehicles. So Enerdata's projections are 35% of the fleet in 2050 for Energreen, for Enerbase, and 70%, double for Energreen. Energreen also gives priority to small EVs and car sharing to try to avoid rebound effects and reduce material footprint, environmental impacts, and extraction of materials and raw materials and rare earths, etc. EVs are also developing significantly in light freight transport and short distance freight transport, whereas hydrogen fuel cells are going to stay in a very small, reduced niche market, in our views. In conclusion, for Enerbase, electric vehicles overtake conventional engines by 2045, and in Energreen, it's about 2027 if we include plug-in hybrids. So it's going to be very quick in the short term. Here you can see when the 50% of sales are going to be reached, depending on the scenarios. And finally, let's have a look at the industry trends, right? We are today about 21% electricity in industry, and this could grow by a factor of 2 in Energreen. For the industry sector, it's crucial to understand that it's not only about electricity, it's also about efficiency more generally, and also circularity and sufficiency, which can improve a bit more, a lot more the emissions of the sector. Circularity, of course, will reduce the need for producing new materials through recycling and reusability. Sufficiency will extend the lifetime of equipment, buildings, etc., reducing the size of equipment, and this will allow also to reduce emissions because there will be less demand for new products. This will also reduce the production in terms of physical production and potentially the economic production as well. The economic output might be reduced as well. Electrification and efficiency are very important for the sector anyway, and we expect heat pumps to develop for low temperature heat and also for middle temperature. And for high temperature, it would be a mix, and it would be also where electric arc furnaces would develop more and other decarbonization technologies. Now let's have a sum up of electrification over the world and across sectors and scenarios. So here you get one very rich bar diagram. What I would like to highlight is that the electricity will increase across all sectors and regions. That's clear. Reaching 40% in EnerBlue, 47% in EnerGreen, whereas we start only at 21%. So this represents a very high growth. If we compare that growth with the historical growth, we used to increase slowly the electricity share in final demand, 5 percentage points in 23 years. And now we expect 19 percentage points or even 26 in 27 years. So it's a change of speed, right? What we see also is that the sectors where there is most change are the transport sector, where there would be an increase of at least a quarter, but can be up to 36% of the energy that gets electrified. And for EnerGreen, we're also converting a quarter of buildings fossil fuels and a quarter of industry fossil fuels into electricity. In terms of global disparities between countries, we see that everybody is increasing its electrification rate, and even the slowest countries will still have 40% of electricity in their mix in 2050. This is an interesting graphic that is made possible thanks to our high geographical disaggregation. Now, let's have a look at energy sovereignty and what our analysis and scenarios can help us say on this topic. So we'll have a perspective on the state level and on the private level. But first, it's important to remind that those transitions are through renewables, of course. We did not talk about renewables much up to now, but it's, I guess it's something we know already, so it's not a big deal. Here, I represent the share of renewables in primary energy. So it's a bit tricky to convert wind and solar, but here we use the factor of 1, so it looks very small. We started at 12% at the beginning of the century. We are at about 15% today, and we expect a trend continuing in our base, but a very strong development of renewables would materialize in EnerBlue and even more in EnerGreen, where we reach 50% in 2038 and 2/3 at the end of the period here, whereas EnerBlue would reach around half of primary energy consumed. Let's have a short focus on biomass here, because historically it's been one of the most contributing renewables, about 10%. In EnerBase, it will still be about 10%, but in EnerBlue and EnerGreen, it will develop across the economy. So it's also interesting to mention that there would be some biomass coupled with CCS in the power sector and industry sector that would capture up to 0.5 gigaton of CO2 by 2050. There would be biofuels in transport, notably for aviation and maritime. About a quarter of the aviation fuel mix would be biofuels. There would be biomethane in the gas grid, up to 60% in EnerGreen. Overall, the role of biomass would increase from from 10% to 17% in EnerBlue, 23% in EnerGreen. So you might ask, well, if we double the role of biomass, are we not risking to destroy our biodiversity and food security? According to most analysis of academic papers that we could find, there is a very high agreement that about 100 exajoules is very conservative in terms of energy that could be exploited as bioenergy globally. And here in EnerGreen, we are below 110 exajoules. So we think it's still sustainable to use that bioenergy potential. I would like now to jump into the dependency on fossil fuels and thus the energy sovereignty linked to fossil fuels. So it's good to remember that fossil fuel exporters are only a small portion of the population. It includes the USA, but it's still 15% of the global population that supply the rest of the 85% of the population. So for most countries, we expect a reduction of dependency on foreign imports for fossil fuels. Here I've drawn the curves for 4 main regions of the world, as you can see, and we expect a very big potential for reduction of the primary energy imported. So on the left side, we see the European Union, which has a very high potential for reducing its imports. It represents a revolution. We start at 2/3 of our energy imported, and we end up at only 10%. This is under EnerBlue. EnerGreen would be very similar because the ambition gap is quite small for Europe. But if we miss this opportunity of an energy transition and we go into the gray area of EnerBase, then we could end up having still 50% of our fossil fuels imported, which would be a very high bill for the European Union and a very big lost opportunity. There is also a very large potential for Japan, which has a specific context based on its geography. So today it's the vast majority of energy that is imported, but it could reduce to about half only if following the EnerBlue scenario. China and India also have huge potentials, but they are still needing a lot of imports due to their very big population and growth of energy demand. For India, it's 73% final energy demand growth across the period. And despite that, efficiency, electricity, and renewables would bring stabilization for this country of primary energy imported. So our conclusion is that decarbonising the energy system in EnerGreen or EnerBlue is a great way to increase the energy sovereignty. Now let's look at what it means in terms of dollars. So the fossil fuel imports represent about $900 billion for the European Union in 2023. For China, it's about 500 billion. And for the USA, so I chose to represent those 3 big regions, for the USA, it's exports of about $45 billion. How does this compare with, let's say, military budgets? So for Europe, we have a military budget of about $350 billion, and we have a new plan of adding $800 billion under the Rearm Europe plan. But this is across 4 years, I think. For China, there is an official number of about $250 billion, although some analysts suggest that it could be close to double that number. And for the USA, so it's as you probably know, it's the highest military budget in the world, standing at $840 billion in 2023. So you can relate the areas of the circles to those numbers and how they compare between fossil fuel trading and military budgets. And now our expertise is on the left side with fossil fuels imports. So let's see what our scenarios provide as future perspectives. Let's look first at EnerBlue, where we reach our engagements and the NDCs. For the EU, it's a reduction of more than almost a factor 3, or let's say a reduction of 60% of the energy imports, fossil fuel imports. For China, it's 10% less bill by 2030. So it's very close. 2030 is in 5 years, and still the European Union bill would reduce a lot. For the US, it's also a bit of a reduction of exports, but then in 2050 it reverses to an increased export of 66 billion. For Europe at the top, you see that it's almost nothing compared to what it is today. So as I mentioned in the slide, in previous slide, you've seen that the potential for Europe of getting free from fossil fuels is huge. And here you see that the fossil fuel imports would be very minor compared to other spending areas. For China as well, it's a huge benefit to drop from 500 billion to 80 billion by 2050. So this is Enel scenario. If we change scenario and we choose Enel Green going further, we increase this aspect with a stronger reduction by 2030 for Europe and China, with more exports of energy in the USA by 2030 and also 2050. And in 2050, the European Union would become exporter of fossil fuels, thanks to a bit of a production that would stay and a change of the global market balance. So this is from a state perspective. Now let's go to a private perspective with the view of households. So the energy bills in households in most countries, and specifically in the northern hemisphere, is dominated by heating needs. And the heating energy demand on the left graph shows how we reduce the consumption from 2023 to 2050 very significantly already in the gray bar of Enerdata. This is due to continuous trends of renovation and improvements of the heating equipment efficiency. So there is a continuous trend, but we see here clearly that in Enel Blue and Enel Green, we reduce even more the consumption thanks to additional heat pump development and additional, so this brings efficiency and additional renovation efforts, as I mentioned earlier. On the right side, you see what it means in terms of budget, right? So what's the budget for heating a household in 5 countries? In the USA, the budget is very small compared to the others because the price of energy and the taxation is different, so it's smaller. But in Europe and Australia, there is a very strong decrease of budget for heating, which can be linked to different causes, among which renovation, heat pumps, and others that we can discuss. So overall, we see that there is a trend towards a more affordable world, and this is even more possible in Enel Blue and Enel Green for heating needs. One contributor of this is efficiency, and another one is sufficiency. Those two graphics show the energy consumption global between Enel base on the top line and Enel Green on the bottom line. And between that, we have colored in blue the sufficiency efforts. So this can be a reduction of up to 9% of energy demand, thanks to behavioral changes, organizational and cultural changes. For example, the temperature setting in buildings, the limitation of appliances in number and in size, the reduction of passenger car traffic of about 14% when comparing both scenarios. Modal shift, going for more active modes, more public transport, and also, well, it should be kept in mind that this modal shift is very different across countries. We have a good geographical description, right? And this shows that the potential for modal shift is not the same everywhere, but there is a good potential for some areas, mostly in developed countries. Also, distances traveled can be very different depending on the lifestyle. And this is linked to ideas such as the 15-minute city, etc. Other policies could bring sufficiency to the energy system and avoid emissions, avoid environmental issues like metal, raw material extractions, etc. The other colors are the yellow of efficiency through electricity technologies and the orange of other efficiency technologies. So those are huge. Of course, using heat pumps and electric vehicles is a game changer because it improves the efficiency of the system by a factor of 3. And overall, we can expect a reduction of energy demand through efficiency by up to 23%, but it depends on the region. And having said that, I would like now to hand over to Esteban, who will lead us through a broader picture, a broader perspective on the EnerFuture scenarios. Over to you.
Thank you, Jacques. So let's take a step back and look on a larger scale at what the world might look like by 2050. Here, as a main result for 3 possible pathways to 2050. On the one hand, if the world continues to follow historical trends, energy consumption will continue to grow until 2045 before beginning to stabilize. As we saw earlier, fossil fuels will be partially reduced and replaced by green electricity and other renewables, which are already cheaper in many cases without additional incentives. However, fossil fuels will still account for 68% of the energy mix in 2050 in such case. As a result, CO2 emission will peak around 2035, but there will be no significant decarbonisation there. On the other hand, if countries meet their NDC commitments and other long-term plans, energy consumption will peak by 2030 and decline slightly until 2050. In this case, dependence on fossil fuels is largely reduced. In 2050, more than half of the global energy consumption will come from carbon-free sources. Thanks to the deployment of renewables, efficiency gain, and sufficiency efforts, CO2 emission will be halved by 2050. However, energy and climate policy have to be reinforced to be aligned with the Paris Agreement. Countries must double the rate of reduction in GDP energy intensity, and the remaining energy uses have to be largely provided by carbon-free sources. If countries strive to stay well below 2 degrees, the world should achieve net zero emission by around 2065. In other words, in 40 years. I'm going to talk briefly about the fuel mix because we have already discussed the key trends resulting in these mixes. So just a few words about coal. Coal consumption will peak before 2030 in any case, because cheaper and less polluting substitutes are already available for a large proportion of coal users. For instance, in the power generation sector, wind and solar capacities have exceeded coal capacities since 2023. Compliance with the Paris Agreement means the end of coal by the end of the century, with a share about 4% in the primary energy mix in 2050. Looking at demand, final energy consumption per capita will stabilize at least over the next few decades. Current pledges which often includes efficiency targets and sometimes sufficiency levels also, allow consumption to decrease close to 1 TUE per capita in 2050. With additional efforts, the per capita energy consumption could fall by 30% compared to current levels. As we saw earlier, electricity will continue to play an increasingly important role in the decades to come, accounting for between a third and almost half of the final energy consumption in 2050. But it's important to bear in mind that half of the role of electricity expands with the ambition of the scenario considered. The corresponding consumption and therefore production is not increased that much due to the reduction of the demand. Indeed, in the global power generation is only 15% higher between Enerbase and Energreen in 2050. Consequently, the environmental pressures due to the infrastructure required for electrification are comparable between Enerbase and other scenarios. Obviously, electrification means electricity to be produced from CO2-free sources. Despite the absence of strong climate policies, the decarbonisation of the production will occur through the expansion of solar PV and wind technologies. This enables CO2 intensity to be reduced by 60% by 2050. Power generation is expected to be one of the first sectors to be entirely decarbonized. The share of renewable should triple by 2050 to comply with the Paris Agreement. Current pledges are starting to come close to this target, even if additional efforts are still needed to go beyond. A word on regional discrepancies. The previous outlooks have provided a global picture, but of course, each country has its own energy history. So far, emission per capita are very different between countries, depending. It depends on their level of economic development and their dependence on fossil fuels, as we saw earlier. So if historical trends continue, changes will be very marginal. But in comparison, the mitigation action paint a completely different picture in 2050. For instance, the EU is almost entirely decarbonized, while the other OECD countries are reducing their emissions substantially. Non-OECD countries remain at a higher level because they have to develop their economies and in parallel decarbonize. So their emission reduction are delayed. To conclude this part, here is a condensed picture of what we have to do, we need to do to stay on a well below 2 degrees per frame. First, consume less energy. Energy consumption has to be reduced by 15% through both energy efficiency and sufficiency efforts in all sectors. Then the remaining energy consumption must be substantially electrified in all demand sectors. This means more than doubling the share of electricity in final demand. And this is boosted by the massive development of EVs in transport and heat pumps in buildings and industrial sectors. Finally, electricity and other energy carriers, such as hydrogen, have to be carbon-free as much as possible. All these levers allow fossil fuel consumption to be reduced by a factor of 5 by 2050. Thank you, and now I will give the floor back to Jacques to conclude.
Yeah, we'll just have a few words, and then it's up to a discussion with you. So I would like to highlight again that energy transition and sovereignty go hand in hand for most regions. There is a publication that came out last week. You can have a look if you want. It's shown at the bottom. It analyzes those aspects as well, and it shows that approximately 70% of countries see a decreased trade risk with lower oil, gas, and coal needs. And this is partly replaced, of course, you will tell, by a new dependency on the imports for equipment to allow this technological decarbonization. And for approximately 82% of countries, this becomes a new dependency. We see here new countries coming up as the main providers, and this analysis highlights the role of China, Australia, as new energy-related hubs. And the system becomes much more renewable overall, of course, with the potential for reducing this dependency, these new ones, through technological improvements, efficiency, or recycling. And okay. You will be able to know more by visiting our interface of EnerFuture, and you can see there all the variables that we showed here from today to 2050 for the 3 scenarios for many sectors and detailed in series. There is a new module, right, for geographically much more detailed demand description with end users and new indicators. Here is a quick wrap up. You will get the slides on the website, and the webinar will be uploaded on YouTube. And we'd like also to thank our colleagues, Aurélien Péfen and Perrine Mézières-Burnin, who were in charge of producing the EnerFuture 2025 publication. You can have more detail by asking the full publication directly. Thank you very much, and let's see if we can exchange now on some of your questions.
So, there is a first question about the role of hydrogen in the mix, and perhaps you can start with how hydrogen is modeled in the Pulse model and the Pulse Enerdata model, and which are the main drivers for such a.
Yeah, you know very well that it's a tricky sector to represent. We've improved significantly our modeling this year. So the way we represent it now is to have the current energy used through hydrogen. So it's mostly in terms of feedstock used as a raw material in chemicals, in the petrochemicals industry, in refineries, I mean, in the direct reduced iron, and to produce methanol, ammonia. So those are all represented in our model now, and we project the production of hydrogen for those sectors into the future with the bottom-up indicators and value added. And this gives us an increasing role for hydrogen anyway as a feedstock. And on top of that, there are new uses that develop across sectors, but the competition is harsh, I would say, between hydrogen and other energy carriers. So in buildings, it's not developed so much, and in industry, it reaches about 5% of the fuel mix. And where it has a bit more potential is in international transport through maritime and aviation. But the dates of this year show that this potential has reduced significantly compared to last year's publication, because we accounted for more detail on the technological transformation and the efficiency losses associated. So overall, the role of hydrogen has decreased on those new energy aspects, but it has improved overall in our EnerFuture publications through a better representation of the feedstock uses. So I invite you to have a look at the EnerFuture outputs to get to more numbers and decisions on that.
There is another question about the role of IA and how we account for electricity demand coming from IA.
AI is one of the drivers of the services sector. So it's not accounted for as a big bump specifically explicit into the scenario. You're right about that, but we still consider that we include it into our services sector. It is a very tricky topic that we are developing at Enerdata. We have a team working on that to understand more about this. There's been a publication of the International Energy Agency last week on the topic, and we are basically working on the same aspects and trying to understand what are the local dynamics. It's good to remember that the artificial intelligence has a very big impact, but mostly on some countries, not on the whole world. The importance globally is still very limited. You will not be surprised to see that artificial intelligence is not developing in Central Africa or in South America. They have other priorities, but it's very big topic in the USA, in Ireland, in Spain, in a few countries like that, in China, where they have a lot of data centers, but it's not a global phenomenon yet.
There is also interesting question about how can the Pulse Enerdata model can help energy companies for forecast long-term commodity prices under different transition scenarios.
Yeah, well, we try to represent the primary drivers of market prices. So we have a representation of the reserves and the used reserves, the probable reserves that drive. We are driving the prices through the evolution of the ratio between reserves and production, reserve versus production ratio, and this is one of the main drivers. So we have projections for one single oil market price, but 3 different gas market prices depending on the region. So there is one gas market in Europe, another one in the Americas, and another one for Asia. So we have differentiation of markets, and we take into account the local dynamics and the trade. So indeed, it's something we work on with energy companies, and we look at different scenarios. Yeah, we can do that, of course. It's a very interesting question, and and of course the model, the Pulse model, allows to look at the interdependencies between the oil prices, the gas prices, and the development of electric vehicles, heat pumps, the decrease of gas boilers, etc. So it's a link between demand and supply.
There is something else about bioenergy, about what kind of absorption we take for resulting GHG. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, but probably we can say that it's difficult to really know the impact of climate, on forest?
Yeah, it's a very tricky question indeed. Thank you, but it's out of our scope because we focus on energy aspects and we do not provide the net zero perspective that includes LULUCF, land use change and forestry. So the impact of carbon sinks that would be much reduced by climate change or concrete factors in some countries like usage for traditional biomass use in cooking, etc. These aspects are out of our expertise, so usually we partner with other colleagues, with specialized colleagues like Solagro or CIRED, which are more knowledgeable on this topic. And then with them we can look very precisely at what kind of crops, what kind of livestock, what it means in terms of energy use, etc., land use and use of biomass in the broader sense. So I was speaking only about bioenergy. So we usually consider zero greenhouse gases linked to bioenergy itself.
There is another question, interesting question about which assumption did you take regarding electric grid control, consumption versus production balance, when you consider 89% of renewables? So.
Okay, so we have a description of the power sector, but it's not as detailed as our colleagues who work on the power market. So we have some constraints that are fed into the model that try to reduce that try to limit the development of variable renewables based on a minimum amount of dispatchable capacities that must be available. And this minimum amount is variable with technological improvement with time. So it's not a direct hourly dispatch over 50 years. It's a more stylized way of representing that. And we have colleagues that are more specialized in these aspects of power markets and flexibility, etc. And grid management. The trade aspect in the electricity sector is key. So we cannot do that into an energy system global level model.
Another question about 15% reduction in final energy demand seems easy from where we stand in Europe, and it's supposed this is going to be different in different parts of the world, and of course.
Final energy demand, yeah, it's an average that we showed here. There are huge potential for many countries, right? I think you've seen also this geographic distinction. It's not the same everywhere. This is something we cannot show in a 40 minutes presentation, but we're happy to answer if you have more local interest into a given country or region. Don't worry anyway, you will get the slides and the recording will be available on YouTube. You'll get the information about that this afternoon or tomorrow. It will be very quick. Thank you everybody for your questions. Is there any other question? Then we'll answer probably by email if you need to. Yeah, there are quite a few other questions, so I'm sorry if we don't have time to answer everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming and listening. Have a good afternoon.